Lieutenant Jake Morrison had been floating in the recovery pod for what felt like hours, when he finally opened his eyes and saw her standing there, watching him through the transparent barrier with those massive violet eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light of the medical bay. The alien woman was tall, easily 7 feet, with skin that shimmered between silver and pale blue, depending on how the light hit it, and her features were sharp and angular, in a way that reminded him of classical sculptures back on Earth. But there was something else too, something in the way she tilted her head and studied him that made his chest tighten, with an emotion he could not quite name. When the pod finally opened with a soft hiss, she stepped closer, and Jake tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy and uncooperative, like he had been sleeping for 1,000 years instead of just a few days since the accident. The woman raised one long, delicate hand and placed it gently on his chest, pushing him back down with surprising strength, and when she spoke, her voice was like music layered with harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. "You must rest, human. Your body endured significant trauma during the spatial collapse." Jake wanted to ask a million questions about where he was and how he had survived and what had happened to the rest of his crew, but all he could manage was a weak nod as exhaustion washed over him again. Over the following days, the alien woman, whose name he learned was pronounced something like Lyria, but not quite, became a constant presence in his recovery, and Jake found himself looking forward to her visits with an intensity that surprised him. She would come into the medical bay with her scanning devices and her data tablets covered in symbols he could not read, and she would study him with a focus that should have made him uncomfortable, but instead made him feel strangely valued, like he was the most interesting thing in the entire universe. One morning she arrived earlier than usual and found Jake attempting to do push-ups on the smooth metallic floor of his room. He had managed about 15 when he heard her enter, and he looked up to find her staring at him with what he was learning to recognize as her expression of intense curiosity. "What are you doing?" she asked, moving closer with those silent footsteps that always caught him off guard. "Exercise," Jake said between labored breaths as he continued his push-ups, keeping my body strong. Lyria knelt down beside him, her face now level with his, and she watched with fascination as his arms flexed and his muscles worked beneath his skin. After a moment, she reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder blade, feeling the movement of his muscles as he completed another repetition. "Your biology is remarkable," she said softly, almost to herself. "The way your muscular system functions with such inefficiency, yet produces such impressive results." Jake stopped mid-push-up and looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Inefficiency?" She nodded, her expression completely serious. "My people engineered our bodies centuries ago to optimize every system. But you humans, you still carry the weight of your evolutionary past in every cell, and yet you persist, you adapt, you overcome." There was something in her voice that made Jake think she was not just talking about his push-ups anymore. He lowered himself to the floor and rolled onto his back, looking up at her as she continued to study him like he was some fascinating puzzle she was determined to solve. Over the next week, Lyria became bolder in her examinations, asking him to perform various physical tasks while she took readings and made notes in her incomprehensible language. She seemed endlessly fascinated by the most mundane aspects of his human biology. The way he sweated when he exerted himself, the way his heart rate increased with activity, the way his body temperature fluctuated throughout the day. One evening, after a particularly grueling series of tests, Jake was sitting on the edge of his bed in the private quarters they had given him, his shirt discarded in the corner, when Lyria entered without her usual array of scanning equipment. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him, and Jake felt suddenly self-conscious under her gaze in a way he had not before. "May I ask you something?" she said, finally moving closer with that same fluid grace that seemed to characterize all her movements. "Of course," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. She sat down beside him on the bed, close enough that he could feel the slight coolness that radiated from her skin, and she looked at him with those enormous violet eyes that seemed to see straight through him. "Why do humans form such strong emotional attachments to one another?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. "I have been studying your species data since you arrived, and I find it inefficient from a survival standpoint. Yet you all seem to crave it desperately." Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer a question that felt suddenly very important. Because connection is what makes us human, he said finally. It is not about efficiency. It is about meaning, about knowing that we matter to someone else, that our existence has value, beyond just survival. Lyria reached out and placed her hand over his chest, right where his heart was beating, and she held it there, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his skin. Your heart rate just increased, she observed. But you are not exerting yourself physically. Why does it do that? Jake felt his breath catch because she was looking at him now with something that was not quite scientific. Curiosity anymore. Something warmer and more uncertain. Because you affect me. Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, because when you are near me, my body responds in ways I cannot control. Her hand remained pressed against his chest, and he could see the confusion and wonder playing across her features as she processed what he had said. I do not understand, she said, but there was a tremor in her voice that suggested maybe she understood more than she was willing to admit. Jake reached up and gently placed his hand over hers, marveling at how cool her skin felt against his palm. Among humans, when two people care for each other, their bodies respond. Their hearts beat faster. Their temperature rises. Their minds become focused on the other person. It is not logical. It is not efficient. But it is real. Lyria was staring at their joined hands now. And when she looked back up at him, there was something vulnerable in her expression. Something that made her seem less alien and more simply a person trying to understand something completely. Outside her experience, I have been experiencing unusual physiological responses since I began studying you. She admitted, her voice soft. My core temperature has been fluctuating in ways it should not. My cognitive processes become less efficient. When I anticipate your presence, I thought there was something wrong with my systems, but perhaps. She trailed off, but Jake understood what she was trying to say. Perhaps you are feeling what I am feeling? He finished for her. She nodded slowly, and then, with a hesitance that was completely unlike her usual confident demeanor, she leaned closer until her forehead was resting gently against his. Is this how humans express connection? She asked. Jake smiled and carefully wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into a proper embrace, and after a moment of stiffness, he felt her relax against him. Her cool skin a pleasant contrast to his warmth. Yes, he said. This is one way. They stayed like that for a long time, neither speaking, as the light in the room slowly dimmed with the artificial evening cycle, and Jake realized that despite being millions of miles from Earth, despite being surrounded by technology and beings he did not understand, he felt more at home in this moment than he had in years. Eventually, Lyria pulled back just enough to look at him again, and there was a small smile on her face that transformed her angular features into something breathtaking. I wish to study this phenomenon further, she said. And despite the clinical language, there was warmth in her voice that had not been there before. Jake laughed and tucked a strand of her silver hair behind what passed for her ear. I think I would like that too. In the weeks that followed, they developed their own language of connection that transcended the barriers of species and culture. Lyria taught him about her world, about the great cities that floated among the stars, and the philosophy that had driven her people to perfect their bodies at the cost of something essential, something human that she was only now beginning to understand through him. And Jake taught her about Earth, about rain and ocean waves and the feeling of grass beneath bare feet, about music and art and all the beautiful, inefficient things that made life worth living. The other members of Lyria's crew noticed the change in her. The way she smiled more readily, the way she seemed less focused on optimization and more interested in experience. And while some viewed it with suspicion, others seemed almost envious. One day, the captain of the vessel, a stern older male with skin like polished chrome, called Jake to the bridge. Your presence here has caused quite a disruption, Lieutenant Morrison, he said. But there was no anger in his voice, only a kind of weary amusement. Apologize, Jake started, but the captain raised a hand. Do not. Lyria has been one of our finest medical researchers, but she has always approached everything with such cold precision that it made even her colleagues uncomfortable. But now he gestured to a display showing Lyria in the medical bay laughing at something while she worked. Now she seems alive in a way I have not seen in any of my crew for many years. The captain turned to look at Jake directly. Whatever you humans have that we engineered, out of ourselves, perhaps it was more valuable than we realized. Jake did not know what to say to that, so he simply nodded and the captain dismissed him with what might.